The Emperor of Mankind lived among humanity for millenniums untold. He's worn many titles: scientist, father, warlord, king. But until he stepped out of the shadows to rekindle the dying embers of mankind, few knew who he was, and few were as cowed by his presence as men across decades of the Great Crusade would be. Before the Crusade, the Emperor walked in the guise of a normal man, a psyker of untold power, this is true, and the greatest among the immortal perpetuals of Earth, but a man nonetheless, and seemingly not what would come to be thought of as a god by many. This drastic change in the Emperor's character has been speculated about by many, with the ultimate turning point being agreed by most to have happened towards the end of the Dark Age of technology, even before humanity had fallen to the artificial intelligences known as the Men of Iron. It was when the Emperor walked as a man, and still had the majority of the perpetuals by his side, that he would embark on a journey to a planet known as Molech. The Emperor and his undying crew would not utilize the warp ships that the Imperium would later put into standard service, instead ferrying themselves on a sub-faster-than-light vessel that only had the capability to reach their destination. The ship that the Emperor used likely places his journey sometimes towards the beginning of the Dark Age of technology, when warp travel was still unstable and somewhat unreliable. It is possible, however, that the Perpetuals feared intervention by the ruinous powers and wanted to limit their interaction with the warp and the powers that dwelled therein, making the timeline of the Molech journey somewhat questionable. Regardless, once the Perpetuals did reach the wild jungle world of Molech, the Emperor would lead them to a gateway into the realm of chaos that resided there. As far as we know, only the Master of Mankind would enter this portal, and when he left it, it was by all accounts forever changed, seeming both more powerful and much more wary than before. Whatever happened within the portal, the Emperor would also take with him the secret knowledge and power needed to create his 20 demigod sons that would later be known as the Primarchs. The Emperor would also, somehow, manage to get all of the Perpetuals back to Terra, even without a functioning vessel, with the exception of Olivia Surica, who he would leave behind as a sentry to watch the warp gate. Though the truth of exactly what happened on Molech is unknown, this moment would prove to be a linchpin in the history of the Imperium, as, without whatever the Emperor took from Molech, he would have been unable to create the Primarchs. A number of theories prevail as to just what the Emperor did within the warp. A main point of contention in the arguments revolve around the fact that the Chaos Gods claim that the Emperor stole something from them on Molech, leaving many to believe that some sort of covenant was forged within the Immaterium and then broken. Though the word of the ruinous powers is also suspect at best, and always at the mercy of their various agendas. However, unless the Chaos God of Trickery, Tetsnich, known for plotting against even himself, simply gifted the Emperor with whatever he needed, it is likely that something more mysterious, and potentially malevolent, did indeed occur between the Emperor and the gods of the Neverborn. Perhaps the darkest among these theories is the idea that the Emperor offered himself to the assembled gods. Being a perpetual and a massively powerful psyker, the Emperor was essentially able to reconstitute himself upon death into a new body, or to heal all of his wounds if his body remained in real space. With time being non-linear within the warp, the Chaos Gods would likely have been aware, even during the years before the Imperium, that the Emperor would come to be their greatest threat to power. Knowing that humanity was rapidly approaching its own doom, through his use of limited psychic foresight, it's possible that the Emperor would seize upon the gods' fear of what he would come to be, and so offer them his next death in exchange for what he needed to create the Primarchs, essentially stating that, if he were to die again, that they would then claim his soul, rather than him instead being reborn. The Emperor would have likely only resorted to this due to his inability to see into the future, past the advent of just before his own son Horus betrayed him, leading him to believe that he may only have a narrow window of time left to prepare the human race for the various threats that were looming on the horizon, such as the rallying of the Orcs, the advent of the Psyker genes reaching critical mass, and the emergence of the Tyranids, among many other looming apocalypses. It would be because of these threats that the Emperor would see that he would need to rapidly shore up his own strengths, and that he would need allies in the form of the Primarchs and the Space Marines to be able to accomplish his goals before his foresight reached its end, which, as far as he knew, could mean that it would be too late for him to save humanity as a whole. This would offer an alternative explanation as to why the Emperor doesn't allow himself to die and be reborn, other than just his needing to sit on the Golden Throne, to keep the warp portal beneath the Imperial Palace from opening, and allowing swarms of demons to attack Terra. Because, as the most powerful perpetual to ever live, it's entirely possible that the Emperor would be able to regenerate himself rapidly and before all is lost if he did choose to allow himself to truly die and leave the throne empty for a time. However, if the Chaos Gods do own his next death, this would mean that he truly cannot allow himself to die and that the throne is the only thing keeping him from the grasp of those who lurk in the warp. Tragically, if this theory is true, it would be one of the very sons that the Emperor sought to create by wagering his soul that would strike him down and sentence him to an eternal torment of constantly struggling to hold on to life and keep humanity and his dreams alive for just one more day. Another, possibly more likely theory, is that the Emperor bet the loyalty of his sons against the Chaos Gods' ability to corrupt them. The Chaos Gods, knowing that the Emperor would become their anathema, would play to his pride and agree to give him what he needed to create the sons that he thought would aid him to defeat them. However, they would offer the stipulation that if they were able to corrupt the Primarchs, that they would then use them to destroy everything the Master of Mankind dreamed of. Alternatively, the Chaos Gods might have told the Emperor that exactly half of his sons would fall, and half would remain loyal. This might have been a bet the Emperor was willing to make in order to restore humanity before it was too late, due to the aforementioned incoming threats. This would also explain why Malcador, the Emperor's greatest ally and closest confidant, would later say that he and the Emperor always expected the Horus Heresy to happen, only that they perhaps didn't expect it to happen as soon as it did, or with so much force. Regardless of whether he knew some of the Primarchs would, or might, definitely fall, or if he just bet on the loyalty of his future children, this too would prove a tragic choice for the Master of Mankind, as his own faith in the Primarchs would prove to be his undoing, as he found himself unable, paralyzed by his love for his son, to strike down the traitorous Horus until the former War Master had left him crippled and half dead. Another more straightforward possibility is that the Emperor approached the Chaos Gods while hiding his true powers and his nature as their enemy. In this theory, he would have hidden his true power throughout history in order to not tip them off, and, when the time of humanity's reclamation was nigh, that he entered the warp and offered his services to them. He would agree to create great generals for the gods that would spread their influence across the galaxy, if they would only give him the power and knowledge he needed to secure the throne of humanity, a goal that perhaps seemed all too logical to the ruinous powers. After being granted what he needed, however, the Emperor would then betray the Chaos Gods, just as they would later say he had, and instead seek to starve them of faith and belief in an effort to weaken and ultimately defeat them. In this rendition, as in all the others, the gods would seemingly have their last laugh, as, possibly due to their origins, the Primarchs would prove to be imperfect and susceptible to chaos. One final theory is that the Emperor didn't make a deal with the Chaos Gods at all. Instead, it's possible that he left a bit of himself in the warp gate on Molech in order to further connect himself to the Immaterium and draw the power he needed to vastly increase his psychic abilities, enough to forge the beings that not only shared his genetic makeup, but also his newfound connection to the warp. This would also offer another reason why the Emperor was so against his subjects worshipping him as a god, as he feared that their worship would influence and reshape the portion of himself left in the warp, and cause him to become less of the man he was and more of the god that they thought he was. Ironically, knowing that humanity would quickly turn to worshipping him if something ever got in the way of the Emperor himself actively stopping this, the faith of his people would also prove to provide a backup plan for if the Chaos Gods were ever able to remove the Emperor from real space, as, over time, the belief of trillions would slowly turn the piece of the Emperor that remained in the warp into a deity all its own, in opposition to the ruinous powers. Seeing the Emperor stealing away their faith and the souls of mankind, the Chaos Gods would thus later proclaim that he was stealing something that they believed belonged to them. No matter what happened on Molech, the Emperor would come back from it, possessed of the vast powers and knowledge necessary to imbue within his sons the immortality, strength, and latent psychic abilities needed to lead his armies. He would also be able to do away with the unstable Thunder Warriors, once he had finally created the genetic code of the Primarchs, as he could then use said DNA to finalize the much more stable gene seed of the Space Marine Legions. Contrary to popular belief, however, the Emperor would not be able to create the Primarchs alone. He would employ the aid of various geneticists and the close assistance of one Perpetual in particular. This would include the head of his biotechnical division during the close of the Unification Wars on Terra, a woman by the name of Amar Astartes, who would become the namesake for the Astartes Space Marine Legions. Astartes would create much of the foundation that was needed to create the Space Marines, such as the black carapace that allows them to interface with their power armor, but she would eventually rebel against the Emperor, believing that the Space Marine project was ultimately doomed to failure due to this being before the completion of the Primarch's DNA stabilizing the gene seed. She would also fear that the Marines would bring a war and horror to the galaxy of a kind untold in humanity's history. Astartes would lead an army of her own loyal, modified soldiers in a coup on the Imperial Palace. She ultimately sought to destroy her work before it could come to fruition, but was killed by a member of the Emperor's elite Custodes Guard. The research of this scientist would go on to form the basis of the Primarch project, along with the efforts of the Emperor. However, while the Emperor did mean to use his own DNA as the foundation of his son's genes, they were not meant to be simple clones of himself. Rather, he would use the genetic code of a perpetual woman by the name of Erda in conjunction with his own to birth them, making Erda the gene mother of the Emperor's sons. The Emperor, however, would go on to refuse to allow Erda to have any influence on the Primarch's upbringing, as he planned to groom them for his great crusade of conquest across the stars. Erda would grow to regret her actions in committing her own blood to a never-ending war and would, by her own claims, go on to open a great warp storm in the laboratories underneath Terra. This rift in real space would scatter the Primarchs across the stars, but would ultimately only delay the Emperor's recruitment of his sons into his great crusade. Interestingly, it is not known if Erda truly opened the warp rift, as some accounts differ and cite the intervention of the Chaos Gods as the source of the storm that scattered the Emperor's sons. Several of the Primarchs would even come to believe that their scattering was the work of the Emperor himself, to include Sanguinius and the traitor Conrad Kurz. Regardless of the truth of Erda's involvement, she would nevertheless go into hiding. And yet, the Emperor, who knew where she was all along, would never seek to take any actions against Erda, perhaps out of a very human love for his children's mother, and of one of the only companions who still remembered him as a man, and from a time before he was known only as the Emperor of Mankind. Despite her best efforts though, Erda's interference would not stop the start of the Emperor's crusade. While the Emperor did not have the Primarchs, because of her actions, he did have their Space Marine legions, which would perhaps exceed even his expectations, and prove more than capable of bringing the many independent human worlds and most Xenos threats to heel. One by one, the legions would conquer what was lost during the fall of mankind, and, one by one, the Emperor's sons would also be rediscovered. Some, like Angron, were forever scarred by the planets that they had landed on across the galaxy. Others, like the Lion, would rise to conquer their adoptive homes, and become great leaders and warriors. All would be shaped by their childhoods, into men that were perhaps very different from what the Emperor had planned for them. And some of them would, of course, fall to chaos because of the emotional trauma done to them and start a civil war within the fledgling Imperium of Mankind. Notably, before the heresy had come into full swing, the Emperor would travel with a group of his newly rediscovered Primarchs to include Horus Lupercal, the Khan, the Lion, and Fulgrim to bring Molech into the Imperium. The Emperor would succeed in taking the world, and would leave behind a massive garrison to protect it and its secret warp rift. Ominously, he would erase the memories of each of his Primarchs, making it so none of them remembered exactly what happened on the planet. When the heresy would finally break out, the forces of Horus and Mortarion would wage a ferocious battle to claim Molech for their own. Upon dispatching the remaining loyalist forces, Horus would enter into the warp rift, and, while only moments would pass for those of his troops that were left behind, by Horus's own accounts, he had fought for eons within the warp, claiming both power and dominion for himself. By the end of this millennium-long conquest in the Immaterium, Horus would emerge from the gate both exhausted and empowered, claiming only that his time on Molech before entering the gate was now a distant memory to him, and that within the gate he had instead won by right what his father had stolen through treachery. Regardless of what truly happened on Molech, the Emperor's journey there would set the stage for the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, and the long decline of the Imperium to come thereafter. And, whatever his intentions or actions to accomplish it, the creation of the Primarchs would ultimately doom the Emperor to the Golden Throne. Though it is possible that the Emperor of Mankind is merely biding his time until his true plans come to fruition and he's once again able to engage the forces of chaos and put an end to their wicked dominion over the souls of the mortal races.